Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you are allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. We have with us today Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership, an organization that's dedicated to protecting religious freedom for all Americans. We have Joe St. George, who's the Chief Legal Officer of the Women of Color for Equal Justice Law. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Walla Walla University. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us, and let's go to our first segment. Our first segment is talking about that we are now in about the 12th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act, or what some people affectionately call Obamacare. The new administration has been working on trying to update activities to ensure that these rules and regulations are being brought up to date. But there were also cases that came from a religious standpoint as a result of that act. So I've got to ask the question today, we're 12 years later on the Affordable Care Act. Where are we with this? Was it a failure? Was it something that made sense? Tell me something that I can know about this so I can get to understand where exactly do we stand right now. Todd, why don't you start us off by talking about this?
So the Affordable Care Act, as you said, was passed. It has become more politically popular. As time has gone on. Attempts by the Republicans during the early Trump administration to overturn it were unsuccessful. Famously, John McCain's thumbs down. However, it has continued to bring, especially with the current administration, issues dealing with transgender care, right? And the administration coming up with regulations that define sex as including transgender and requiring organizations to provide care that may violate certain religious hospitals and organizations' beliefs. So, we have settled into sort of a detente, but there are still issues and skirmishes around it.
But Tim Schultz, what are we talking about right now? There was a lot of talk that this was going to be a ton of ills that were going to come from this. We're 12 years later. Are churches more comfortable with it right now? We've seen cases like Hobby Lobby and things of that nature. Where exactly do we stand, and what's the current administration trying to do with it?
Well, my view would be that there was a lot of apocalypticism on all sides about this. Apocalypticism from conservatives at the beginning, saying this was going to crash our healthcare system. That hasn't really come true. And then after the Hobby Lobby decision, which you referenced, and which just meant that certain religious employers did not have to provide certain kinds of drugs that violated their religious beliefs, there was a lot of apocalypticism from the left after that decision, and that hasn't really come to pass either. So as Todd said, I think we have settled into a detente, and I think some of the most shrill predictions on both sides have failed to come to pass.
But Joe, where are we when we see that we're starting to move into new directions right now? Are we in a position where maybe we have to relook at Obamacare, or do we go back and restart all over again? Where exactly do we stand now?
No, I think it's settled in. The key, most important issue is the requirements that you seeing now with regards to requiring hospitals to do certain medical treatments. Again, hospitals, entities have religious protections, especially religious institutions, and doctors will agree and have testified that the medical practice is a religious practice. And so to require a medical facility that has religious focus in their practice to practice a medical practice that's against their religion is too far. Everything else, though, I would just say bring down the what they need to do is bring down the amounts that each individual has to cover, the 2,000 and 3,000. That's something perfunctory, but as it relates to forcing religious institutions to do medical practices that are against their religion, that is where it went too far.
But Tim Golden, I got to ask you this, though. When we start talking about that your medical and your religious combination of thought process is what should carry today, haven't we gone a little bit too far? If you're in the healthcare organization, you should be engaged in healthcare activities. What's the issue here?
Well, perhaps we have gone too far, and I think we're going to continue to see cases pop up from time to time in this healthcare context, in the context of Obamacare, where there's a tension between a hospital or some other healthcare organization's religious mission and the requirements of the law that that organization provide care. What I will say is that at this point, we have very strong reliance interests in maintaining Obamacare. There are a lot of people who depend on this law and the things that it did to give them health coverage. And more people are covered now, I think, than almost at any other time in American history. So it's been a real benefit to people. And other than the conservative disdain and contempt for Chief Justice John Roberts for upholding it the several times that he did, I think we're seeing our way past the ideological battles and settling into more of a normal with Obamacare, where these cases will continue to pop up from time to time, but you're not going to see the sort of apocalyptic thinking that Tim Schultz referenced a moment ago.
But Todd, we're looking at still the concept of what some people would just simply call redistribution of wealth. We're still taking funds from one group to help take care of another group. Is that something that we're going to be okay with, or is the right side going to ever get comfortable with that?
Well, I think it's going to settle into essentially what we have with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, right? Those are similar, back historically, very progressive policies that now, endure wide support. There are certainly conservative individuals out there who would like to get rid of all three of those programs. But really, anytime that gets raised, it's political poison. And I see the Affordable Care Act sort of eventually falling into the same scenario. I don't think it's ever going to be as popular as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, just because of its complexity. And quite frankly, it didn't accomplish, it wasn't the Affordable Care Act. It didn't really reduce cost. What it did do is expand access. And that's been popular with a lot of people.
Tim Schultz, it expanded access. It didn't reduce cost, but I thought a big part of it was to reduce cost.
Yeah, and I think that it's really hard in our country to reduce cost. Healthcare is one of those goods that seems to be just becoming more expensive all the time. And it's unclear exactly how much government policy can do about that, because some of this is related to the certain conditions in our own healthcare markets. It's just a really tough problem for a single piece of legislation to solve.
Well, it sounds
one of the problems, Orland, is, people talk about reducing costs, but here's the thing is, all those costs and inefficiencies, somebody's making a lot of money off that, right? And that somebody is going to push back like crazy to keep those inefficiencies. So I agree with Tim that the inefficiencies in our healthcare system, there's too many constituents, right, that are going to bat for it.
I just want to add that the positive thing in Obamacare was the approval of interventions that were considered natural plant-based interventions that can be used by doctors, which also are religious medical practices by many people. It just, that part of the bill has never really seen the light of day because of the interests that Todd mentioned, who have a lot of money to promote one type of medical care that keeps people dependent on utilizations of drugs. And that's where the runoff has been and the takeoff. So there's opportunity, though, to bring those efficiencies down by promoting plant-based remedies, diet and lifestyle medicine that's supported by the bill, but it needs to be supported with resources and leadership from the administration to make it a priority.
Joe, I'm going to let you have the last word on that, but it looks like we're going to be looking to see if this Affordable Care Act will one day become just like Medicare and Social Security. Let's go on to our next segment. This is a segment that I think you'll find very interesting. I was reading an article the other day that was talking about the Christian response to critical race theory. And if the thought process is that critical race theory is looking back on where we have been as a nation and looking at maybe some of the ills that have taken place, that from a Christian perspective, that should be something we should want to do and go back and talk to our fellow man, make things right and move forward. But I don't get the sense that people are comfortable with this. This critical race theory conversation seems to have everyone completely blown into many different directions, and it is dividing the country between left and right. Tim Schultz, tell me what you think about this critical race theory, and from a Christian perspective, how should we be handling it?
Well, this is complex because there's the kind of academic definition of critical race theory. In fact, one of the professors that I studied with at Georgetown Law School was one of the really leading academic experts behind critical race theory. So I've known about it for 30 years. On the other hand, there's sort of what that term has come to mean, which is sort of anything about race that I don't like. And so critical race theory as a term has sort of migrated. And I think that we have to be very careful about what we're talking about here. So I think as Christians, that's actually the first thing we should do. Just is really not bearing false witness against our neighbor and really trying to understand how they're defining their terms and what they're saying. When they say critical race theory, what are they actually talking about? I think there's a lot of smoke around this right now. And I very think the first thing we can do as Christians is really listen to our neighbors and hear what they mean when they say critical race theory.
But Tim, Golden, we are living in a society now where nobody wants to listen to their neighbor. It seems like they're just listening to the sound that's inside their own heads. How do we handle this from a Christian perspective? How do we handle this in terms of grace and love and things of that nature? Or is that just out the window? We're never going to see that happen.
Well, I think that we have to follow the advice of Tim Schultz. I think he just articulated rather nicely the distinction between what critical race theory actually is and what it means to people in political circles. The fact of the matter is, Orland, that we live in a world in which we can reinforce our misunderstanding of terminology through the algorithms of social media. We only see things posted from people who agree with us, and we walk around in a social media bubble without realizing it. The fact of the matter is that the migration of the term critical race theory, as Tim Schultz just referred to it, is that it abides now in a political space in which it is a solution in search of a problem. Tim Schultz just mentioned that he studied under, I think you may be talking about Gary Peller.
No, I was talking about Mari Matsuda and Charles Lawrence, her husband.
Oh, okay, very good, very good. Two of the leading critical race theorists. The fact of the matter is, Orland, critical race theory in the ideological sense is a battle that's being fought at the elementary and junior high school level and high school level. And the fact of the matter is that critical race theory proper was originated as a legal theory about the permanence of racism and institutional racism in legal education, in law schools. If you pulled your average sixth grader off the street, they wouldn't know anything about critical race theory. And we've somehow transformed it into a straw man, into something that it isn't. And the sad reality is it isn't even taught at the elementary and high school level and junior high school level, but that's where the battles are being fought. Why? Because conservative ideologues and demagogues can beat their chest and say, this is what's happening to our kids, and it works well politically. But the reality is that critical race theory, as it's rightly understood, has nothing at all to do with elementary or secondary education. It has everything to do with legal education, and it was started essentially by an African-American law professor at Harvard University who passed away about 11 years ago named Derek Bell.
Well, I got to ask you, Todd, I've been in a lot of spaces where the thought of critical race theory is just trying to bring up something from the past, dredging up bad feelings, and is not really helping our society to move forward. I mean, where do you come out on this?
I'm reminded of a conversation I had with J.L. Chestnut. I'll see if anyone recognizes that name. He was, I would say, maybe a second-tier civil rights official during the civil rights era. I think he was from Selma, I think the first Black attorney in the state. And he came to the University of Illinois. This was in the late 90s, law school. And I asked him a question. At that point, affirmative action was sort of in the news a lot, was being discussed. And I said, listen, you believe that affirmative action is still necessary in this country. When do you think it would no longer be needed, right? Because the idea, at least at the time, was affirmative action was a bridge idea, not something that should be permanent. And his response says the country that you live in, pointing to me, is different than the country that she lives in, pointing to a Black female law student that was sitting, close to me. And I think that's where we're at on this issue, right? Is It's which version of reality, do you want to look at? And critical race theory is looking at it from a particular perspective. And I think those that don't agree with it see things differently. And that makes one of the hard parts of this issue is it's almost impossible to have a conversation because individuals, it's such a sensitive issue and charges of racism get thrown around so quickly and so easily that nobody really wants to engage on this topic. And I don't see that changing in the near future.
But Joe,
Well,
this is my problem. This is my problem. I don't understand how we get this going from a Christian perspective. Tim, were you getting ready to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's interesting. Todd mentioned in his remarks just a second ago about affirmative action. If you go back and you study the story of Reconstruction in the United States, you will find that the same arguments that are made today against affirmative action were the same arguments that were made in the 1870s against the existence of the Freedmen's Bureau. The idea was that slavery is gone, we're all free, that's all in the past now. Why should we give Black people 40 acres and a mule? Why should we help Black people? And this notion that the past is the past and that we have to leave it behind. The fact of the matter is we live in a world today where African Americans still don't have their right to vote protected under federal law. African Americans are essentially living in a pre-1965, pre-Voting Rights Act world. And so the past is not going to go away because the past seems to me to be always the present, and the present seems to echo the arguments of the past. And that's the real insight of critical race theory that no one wants to discuss.
Timothy, let me jump on that. What Timothy said. Critical race theory does not nullify history. Okay, and I think we can really cut to the chase and hold people accountable who are using critical race theory as a dog whistle to justify trying to create a new narrative around history, American history, which includes Black history. And how we do that is to address the critical issue. And that is critical race theory, does it nullify Black history? If it doesn't, then you teach children from K through 12 in college and forever, Black history. And whatever that history is, you have to live with it because those choices were made in history. Critical race theory can be used in the courts for the purpose of either establishing racist behavior or institutional racism for the purpose of establishing discrimination. And we
but Joe,
having these narratives. Hold on, Timothy. Not allowing these false narratives to keep going on and on when we know we have situations where teachers who have pictures of Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, have their pictures ripped off of their student boards because of critical race theory, and it's not appropriate for children when it's nothing but history. So I think we need to hold people accountable to what it is and stop playing the mind games around usage and terminology. It hasn't progressed. The definition of critical race theory hasn't progressed. The definition hasn't changed. It is what it is, and we need to hold people accountable and call them out.
Tim Golden, I'll give you the last word on
that. I just want to make this point in response to something Joe said. I appreciate everything you said, Joe, and I agree with you. I will say this, however, an integral part of critical race theory is a trenchant critique of liberalism and individual rights, and a real critique of the notion that African Americans who use the legal process can depend on that and that alone for racial progress. So I just wanted to make that point.
Tim, I'm going to have to let that be the last word on that, but I think this is a conversation we're going to keep having for a very long time. Let's go on to our next segment.
The whole show on this.
Let's go on to our next segment. I want to talk about a specific case. This case is actually called Orr versus Christian Brothers High School. It's a case that really got going as it related to the court's decision, as it relates to the minister at a school and dismissing some complaints of discrimination. It was an African-American principal who was fired, some would say without reason. Tim Golden, can you take us through this case and give us a little understanding what this was all about?
Sure. Well, this is a case out of the Ninth Circuit in which the Ninth Circuit essentially held that a racial discrimination claim, that the facts of that claim were so intertwined with the religious mission of the school that they could not be separated. And the fact that they couldn't be separated meant that the ministerial exception would apply. This is one of those problematic cases that we referenced before, in which a claim of racial discrimination appears to perhaps be legitimate or have some weight to it, but it's going to be subordinated to the claims of religious freedom of the school based on the ministerial exception. So this is I think sort of a classic problem case in which we're facing a religious claim that runs up against another claim of discrimination, and this is the real difficulty in giving broad deference to the ministerial exception under the First Amendment.
Todd,
Timothy, can
right
you give
decision?
more detail?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Timothy, can you just give a little more detail on that conduct by the individual who was terminated?
Well, as I understand it, he claimed that he was the victim of a hostile workplace discrimination, that he received a variety of threats and racial slurs were hurled at him by members of the religious community who essentially did not want him to be principal of the school. And it was in that context that he filed his claim. And what the Ninth Circuit basically ruled was, we have to defer to the school under the ministerial exception. And that's what's so troubling about this case to so many people, is that what appear to be legitimate claims of race discrimination have been set aside in the interest of accommodating the ministerial exception under the First Amendment.
So Todd, in conjunction with Hosanna Tabor, did they make the right decision here? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this case is a complete no-brainer. It's not, I don't know really what there's even much to discuss about it. I mean, if the principal of a Christian school does not qualify for the ministerial exception, if he does not have a role in the teaching and propagation of the faith, then nobody does. I mean, the idea, like I said, that the leader of a Christian school, isn't involved in the furtherance of the mission of the school and the propagation of faith, I think is just a complete non-starter. And that's why the district court ruled against him. That's why the court.
Todd, tell me, how is this case different from Newman versus Piggy Park, a case in which a white Southerner in the wake of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which ended Jim Crow, said that his business was exempt because his sincerely held religious belief told him he didn't have to serve African Americans? How is this case different from a case like that? Explain that.
So, Tim, I mean, you're comparing something from 50 years ago that dealt with a completely different set of laws and a different set of environments. The answer is that the ministerial exception is attempting to protect organizations from making decisions about leadership, right? And if you don't have a ministerial exception, which, by the way, the Supreme Court endorsed 9-0, then you really are allowing the government to decide who the pastors are. The situation you're talking about was a for-profit business, and it was an individual who was explicitly attempting to deny rights based upon religion. Here, the school was not saying our religious compels us to discriminate this person against because of their race. They were saying, no, we fired him for other reasons, but court, you don't get to second guess that. And I think that was the outright outcome. And quite frankly, any other outcome would mean the ministerial exception has virtually no meaning.
But the fact that,
let's just admit, Tim, the only thing that makes this case different is that the set of facts here, are inflammatory. And I would not say, I mean, listen, whether he has a legitimate claim or not, anyone can write anything in the complaint, right? So I don't know that it was a complaint that seemed legitimate. He didn't ever back it up with evidence. He didn't get the chance to, but I've seen a lot of cases and you can write anything in a complaint.
But
let me make this point,
just
Tim.
like you can write anything in a complaint, you can hide anything behind the ministerial exception.
Well, no, you can't.
That's the issue.
You can't.
Tim, I agree with you, but let me make this point. What you're really battling over is the McDonnell-Douglas case that has this automatic this burden shifting that allows employers to get out of a case on motion for summary judgment once they give some non-discriminatory reason for their conduct. Me as a trial lawyer who tries cases in other contexts have always had a problem with McDonnell Douglas. In any other case, if you have a material issue of fact that's in dispute, the individual's claim and their facts and the employer's claims and their facts, it should go to a jury. And the jury then decides when there is material facts and let everybody put their facts on the table and meet their burdens, but let it go to a jury. I've always had a problem with McDonnell Douglas giving automatic dismissal for employers. And that's really what you're looking for, Timothy. It's not so much that the ministerial line preference is not there. It's should it be held up to the scrutiny of a jury hearing the facts, weighing those facts, and ultimately making the decision and not denying people their day in court, because there are mixed motives, especially when involving Black and brown people or people of various genders. That's when you have the overlap between religion and or any other reason an employer makes. And so,
Joe, I'm gonna have to let that be the last word. I'm gonna have to let that be the last word. Obviously, this is something we could talk about for quite some time, but let's get into our final segment. And I'm just gonna go with Tim Schultz in 10 seconds. Tell me something I don't know.
In 10 years, Obamacare will still be the law of the land, ironically enough, because of something President Ronald Reagan said, and that is that a government program, once enacted, is the closest thing you will ever see to eternal life on this earth.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know in 10 seconds.
Despite colossal failures on police reform and voting rights for African Americans in the United States Senate, President Biden will hold up his nomination of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Black community as evidence of his loyalty to them. And sadly, many African Americans will believe it.
Joe, tell me something I don't know in 10 seconds.
10 seconds. Congressman McGregor introduced a bill that will require Medicaid and Medi-Cal to pay for medically tailored meals, and that includes plant-based meals. So look forward to the change in how healthcare is delivered using natural remedies.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The Supreme Court is likely, though not guaranteed, to overrule the case called TWA versus Hardison this term in a case Groff versus DeJoy dealing with U.S. Postal Service. They'll consider it in the fall, later this fall and early winter, and I think likely will take the case and overturn Hardison.
Great. Well, thank you all for being with us today. And thanks again for being here. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you have a chance, please go to our show at Faith and Politics TV and like and share. And just remember, if it's about God and government, it's about faith and politics. See you next time.